What I propose to do is to take you through parts of the report and ask you to elaborate and explain at certain junctures. But before that, just some overarching points. I think you all accept, I gather from your report, that falsehoods should be something that should not be part of the information landscape whatsoever, correct?
Yes.
And the question then is, where these falsehoods then come and undermine national security interests, social cohesion, that's when it begins to be very threatening. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes. And in that context, I mean, you referred at paragraph 2 of your report to a Human Rights Watch report titled Kill the Chicken to Scare the Monkeys, as an example of how a foreign-funded NGO can both rely on and use falsehoods to advocate political change in another country. Right?
Yes.
That's something that has a potentially serious risk for Singapore, correct?
Yes.
Now, if you look at page 2, same page, paragraph 3, okay, there's no paragraph 4, but so 3 and 5, these two paragraphs. What you're saying here is that HRW, in their report, has used false and fabricated allegations in its political discourse, and the purpose of doing that is to sow seeds of doubt on national issues and government relations with various institutions of the country, right? Would you care to elaborate on some of them in the context of what you say here, as well as over the next couple of pages from paragraphs 9 through to 17? If you just quickly cast your eye over it, just by way of some examples, elaborate on them.
Yes. Okay. So basically, I think the examples that we cited, and certainly that this report cited, was attempting to legitimize examples that were clearly false. Right? So the examples included Roy Ngung's case that the Prime Minister misappropriated funds, Ellen Shadrake's allegation that the courts and prosecutors conspired to hang innocent defendants, and the attacks on foreigners with fabricated facts, which TRS perpetuated. And the HRW report seemed to suggest that all this was okay, that these people should not have been prosecuted, and this was all legitimate part of discourse. But we're, of course, of the view that false news, in fact, undermines public discourse. And I think the committee has heard, and we've obviously read in the news about the witnesses that came earlier on, and it's quite clear that false news, in fact, is very attractive, it's very sensational, and even TRS made a lot of money out of it, enough to buy private property in Australia, right, with just fake news. So this is clearly a concern, and the biggest concern, of course, is that the assumption, of course, and even I had this assumption when I was a teenager, was that the truth will always prevail, but the facts just don't bear that out.
Well, in fact, I think other experts have told us that the truth is always several steps behind the false information.
Yes, yes. Right. And certainly the government's green paper, all the examples given there of how basically the lies, trumped the facts in many of the elections and all that was certainly worrying.
Right. I'd like to ask you to look down to page, okay, there isn't a page number, so paragraph 31. Where you make the point here that the spread of deliberate falsehoods would seriously affect democracies, undermine national institutions, change values for the worse. Yes. And at paragraph 33, the HRW report is an example of how false and misleading impressions created by selective presentation of facts promote an underlying agenda to undermine a well-functioning society. And bear in mind that the HRW report that we talk about is specific to Singapore.
Yes.
And at paragraph 34, to give legitimacy to the process, HRW has described itself and also presented itself as an independent and objective human rights watchdog. But you make the point here at paragraph 34 that when you take a closer look, it is not transparent, and that you say at paragraph 37 that whilst it tries to cast itself as an objective and well-researched critique, a closer look reveals a biased and flawed methodology. Could I invite you to explain and elaborate on these propositions, please?
Sure. So, Human Rights Watch, I think, is an NGO that has been around for a very long time. But of course, when you look closer at it, you realize that you don't really know where it's getting its money from, You don't really know how it monetizes, how it hires people, who are the ones writing the individual articles.
Yes.
And what was most damning, I think, was its longtime founder, Robert Bernstein, also joined its critics, I think around 2009, in particular saying that its coverage of the Middle East was extremely biased, right, in that particular case against Israel. And to me, looking at this report, it seems to be very much in line with that. You present a one-sided story, you interview 34 people, you don't put any evidence on the other side, and based on this interview, you have an article that reads, superficially it reads, nicely, but of course, what it leaves out is vital, right? Including the evidence that goes on the other side, the reasons that these people had findings made against them. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, it's a report that completely lacks objectivity. Its funding sources are obscure, and its fundamental thrust, and this is what we had the most discomfort with, is that falsehoods are all right. Right? That all these people engaging in deliberate falsehoods were right to do it, and the government was somehow wrong, or the authorities were wrong, or the courts were wrong to come down on it. And to me, it's basically saying that even our existing laws to tackle deliberate falsehoods are too harsh, when in fact I think our existing laws are insufficient.
I understand. Paragraph 37C in particular, you then cite some other studies that were done by third parties germane to the issues which are covered by HRW in the report.
Yes.
And at D, you then say that it does not mention these third-party sources. Can you just briefly comment on that?
So, if you read the HRW report, it basically starts from the premise that the Singapore government is not trusted, it's an oppressive regime, and it uses a whole variety of institutions to undermine contrary speech and so on. But in fact, the example that we cited was the Adelman Trust Barometer, and this is an objective, I think, commercially run organization which has a long history in this kinds of research, and they've said the trust in the Singapore government is at 65% and media is 52%. But if you contrast that to places like the US and the UK, the trust in government was 33 and 36%, so significantly lower, just over half of that in Singapore. And interestingly, trust in the media was also lower, 42% for the US and 32% for the UK. And this is clearly evidence that goes the other way from an objective source that any neutral or independent-minded organization should have put forward.
Were these third-party pieces of information or studies cited in the report?
No, not as far as I know. Looked at it, yes.
All right. Can you move on to paragraph 38?
Yes.
I think you mentioned these examples earlier. Unless there was anything else you wish to add to it, I could move on.
No, in fact, those are the exact examples that I elaborated on earlier.
Those are the examples,
yes.
Okay. Just have a look at your concluding remarks, paragraph 39. You say that the report deliberately paints a misleading picture of Singapore.
Yes.
It does so by carefully selecting 34 individuals who do not represent what most Singaporeans experience. HRW also carefully omits facts which are inconvenient. Paragraph 40, individual falsehoods are all the more egregious because it is perpetuated under the guise of objectivity and independence, which HRW tries to project. The misleading picture is painted by HRW to serve its underlying agenda, which is to change Singapore society in the way it desires. Can you comment on those two paragraphs?
Sure. So, the HRW report was, put online, and obviously there'll be many people who think this is an independent NGO commenting on Singapore. It's a long report, and there are very specific recommendations on things that need to be changed, and it advocates that with this selective use of examples, right? No proper evaluation. So it is clearly a piece in advocacy.
Would you say that the use of the label as an NGO is designed to lend some degree of credibility to the report?
Well, I think the NGO existed before the report came out, but certainly that does lend credibility, and that is a concern because NGOs, like in this case, which advocate the use of deliberate falsehoods, are a concern.
All right. Paragraph 44, I think it's the last paragraph here. You say the HRW report as a type of deliberate falsehood is becoming increasingly prevalent and easily put online, can be widely circulated with or without attribution. and it can influence opinions, impede fair, honest debate on issues. I just want to get your comment on that.
So I was going to say, I mean, if the news on Cambridge Analytics came out before we wrote this paper, that would likely have been the focus as a case study, right? Because there it's so clear, so transparent that there is money involved. Organizations gather data, use data to affect change in other countries.
Right.
And it's clear that this is just one example of a much larger practice, right? And especially where it may even be that the organization itself is subverted, right? Because it doesn't know who it's getting its fundings from. Particular pieces of research may be funded. And this is entirely possible where money flow into organizations is not transparent, origins of news is not transparent, but sensational stories get circulated regardless of origin.